Today we had on an old friend of Nick and I's named Mary Margaret Olahan. She is a senior reporter for the Daily Signal and the author of a new book, Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult.
And then finally, Instagram, which has an underrated aspect to it for girls especially, in that most teenage girls, when you're, 12, 13, 14, every time you see an older girl, you're kind of looking at her like, okay, is that who I want to be? Is that how I want to be? Because you, as a younger teenage girl, you are desperate to be an amazing woman. You want to be beautiful. You want to be loved, appreciated. And a lot of these girls go on Instagram and see these very sexualized depictions of femininity, and it scares them. They think, I don't look like that. I don't know how to look like that. I don't know how to act like that. And they want to, because they see all the affirmation that these women are getting from men online, and the very, high number of likes and reposts or whatever that they get. And a bunch of the detransitioners in my book told me that they would go on Instagram and be really put off by these depictions of womanhood because they didn't think they could match up. And then they were all exposed to pornography at a really young age. So in pornography, they're seeing women being degraded, humiliated, debased. And one girl told me it looked like fun for the men, but not for the women. So when you kind of combine those representations of womanhood with the ones on Instagram, these girls are thinking, I don't know how to look like that, and I don't think I want to be that. And when you also combine the fact that a lot of these girls have experienced some kind of sexual assault, it's not really that surprising to me that they would want to get away from being a woman. It's too scary. It's too hard. And they would rather undergo a double mastectomy to try and become a man rather than continue down this path. That's something that I find very, very scary, because when you have doctors, the people who are supposed to be trusted with our lives and with our children's lives, believing fake ideology over biology and science, we are all in a tight spot. And so, that translates into how they care for our youth and adults too, who identify as transgender. Because, for example, Helena Kirshner, she told me this really scary story about how when she was taking testosterone, she was suffering very dramatically, physically and mentally. And I can get more into the side effects if we want to later. But she was really, really suffering. And so she checked herself into a hospital in Chicago, Catholic one, actually, and she asked them to help her. When she checked in, she told them that she was a guy, but they knew she was a woman taking testosterone, but she gave them a male name and male pronouns. And the hospital, knowing that she was a woman and knowing that she was taking testosterone and knowing that she was suffering, went with her preferred name and pronouns and treated her as if she were a biological man who needed help with his mental distress. So they knew what her biology was and they knew what the actual problem was, but they went with ideology over facts and science to pretend to go along with all of this and ignored her actual distress. And I might sound repetitive there, but I think it's a really good example of just how insane all of this is. She needed help, and instead they pretended she was a man and gave her meds as if she were a man suffering with mental health, which exacerbated her problems, and she ended up back in the hospital. I think that's a great example of how these insurance companies are fast-tracking the gender transitions as well and not acting responsibly. Then when the young people or older people want to detransition, so effectively they just want to go back to living as their biological sex, who they always were, there's no insurance coverage of their detransition, and the doctors don't know how to help them. So Prisha, for example, was suffering from all kinds of complications from the testosterone, and she had undergone a double mastectomy. But I think a lot of the time, a lot of the complications come from the hormones because they impact you very dramatically physically, and then there's also a lot of mental side effects. So she tried to find doctors to help her, and she couldn't. They would either say, I don't know how to help you, or I don't want to help you. And this is kind of across the board. We'll hear all the time about detransitioners who need medical help, and they're just going doctor to doctor to doctor. And they'll talk about it publicly. And Prisha was tweeting about it publicly for a while. She'd tweet like, oh, I'm going to see this doctor today, say a prayer that they'll be able to help me. And then she'd tweet that night. She'd tweet that night and say that she wasn't able to find help through that doctor, and that she was going to try another one the next day.
So obviously there's some sort of financial upside to doing the transition surgeries, but not the detransitioning. So financially, like what's the infrastructure set up like for the doctors, the pharmaceutical companies? How are they making money off this?
Our data on how many people detransition is really skewed because so few detransitioners will actually go back to the doctors and report that they want to detransition. And that's what a lot of the researchers base their data on in this case is how many detransitioners went back to the doctors and reported transition regret, which is what they prefer to call it. And so if you Google any of this, you'll see that the detransition, the transition regret rate is 1%. That's what all the transgender activists will tell you, or any of the experts that talk to media. It's 1%. But the fact of the matter is that only, I believe, 24% of detransitioners actually went back to their doctors and said, I regret this. And if you think about it, it's not that surprising since in a way, it would be like someone who was abused going back to their abuser and saying, I dislike that you abused me and I'm here to just let you know that. It's kind of unusual, right? The doctor was the person that removed a young girl's breasts, for example. That young girl to go back to the doctor and say, this didn't make me happy. I actually feel worse and I wish you didn't do this. It would surprise me. So I'm actually surprised that the rate is so high of people reporting transition regret. But the issue there too is that because so few people report it, the data is skewed. And so we don't actually know how many detransitioners there are. And without conservative media amplifying their voices and without Twitter or X, we wouldn't know at all about these detransitioners because their voices would be drowned out. They're not represented in establishment media and they're not cared for by the doctors and the medical establishment. And that's something that you'll see a lot in, for example, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They'll talk about, if they talk about detransitioners, there's always a little note that says very few people actually regret their transition, which is based on nothing except pro-transgender studies. And we don't have enough of them. So we definitely need to see more data on that.
One of the other asides that the transgender lobby says a lot is all of this stuff is reversible, that
Yes.
if you decide you no longer want to go down a direction, there's no permanent damage. Obviously, that's not true. Can you describe a little bit about what the permanent long-term effects, even if people get off the hormones or try to unwind it, how there's real long-lasting damage there?
Well, for the girls, when they take testosterone, there's instant physical and mental effects. The mental ones actually scared me more, but I'll talk about both. Helena, for example, experienced intense rage, just like she had never felt before. It was so bad that her father had her try and chop wood outside to get some of that pent-up aggression out. She also lost Prisha Mosley, one of the other girls in the book, lost the ability to scream, which is really scary. I know we all have dreams where we try and scream when we're in a bad situation. We can't, or maybe that's a woman thing.
Yeah, I don't dream at all.
I mean, I think it's a very common female dream is that you're trying to run away from someone or you're trying to get somewhere and you scream and nothing comes out. And so,
sorry, when you say she wasn't able to scream, like her voice wouldn't get that loud, or what is it?
Her voice would no longer go to that pitch.
Wow.
Nothing would come out. And in the same way, this is kind of an emotional and physical side effect. A bunch of these girls lost the ability to cry. So they would feel the intense emotional urge to cry or the physical urge to cry and the emotional side of that as well. And they just couldn't. And Helena, I believe it was, described just feeling so emotionally frustrated because she didn't have the release that comes with crying. She knew she wanted to, but she couldn't. And she just described feeling very confused and overpowered by this sensation because it was unlike anything she had experienced before. But the testosterone affects your bone growth. It affects your bone density, your muscle growth. Chloe Cole now, who transitioned in her teens or tried to transition in her teens, she says that her shoulders feel too heavy for her body. Her shoulders are just the density is different. It's more of the bone density you might find in a boy rather than in a girl. And with that comes all kinds of aches and pains that she doesn't really know what to do with. She hasn't found good medical help to help her discern what those are. She has a lot of issues with her muscle growth, their bone density, and thankfully, as she's been detransitioning, there's less issues with this. But when they were on testosterone, there's a lot of hair growth, hair loss in places that you wouldn't expect, hair growth in places you wouldn't expect. Their skin becomes coarser, their hair becomes coarser. Just a lot of different things you wouldn't expect. In terms of fertility, many people who transition or attempt to transition using hormones lose the ability to have kids. And this is something that the World Professional Transgender Health Association, WPATH, the leak of the WPATH files recently showed that the doctors who are the so-called experts in this area knew that girls on testosterone were losing the ability to have kids. They knew that girls on testosterone were developing tumors. They knew all kinds of side effects from it, but they were keeping quiet on it. And meanwhile, they're praising gender affirming care, praising testosterone, acting as though it was safe, and all the, I think what media organizations say is all major medical organizations support gender affirming care. WPATH, one of the major medical organizations, knew what was going on. They knew it was experimental, and they were still pushing it. And then when it comes to surgeries, of course, there are very obvious irreversible effects there. When a young girl undergoes a double mastectomy, she can never get her breast back. And that's something that is really worth talking about too, is these girls didn't know when they went in for their surgeries. They didn't fully understand the implications. Some of these girls think that their breasts will grow back. That's how uninformed they are. And they have never held hands with a boy before. They've never kissed anyone before. And they're going in for irreversible gender surgeries that are tied to their so-called sexual preferences that they supposedly have as a young teenage girl. They've never thought about whether they want to have kids. They've never thought about whether they want to nurse one day. And they're making these massive life decisions that they can't actually consent to. And that's something that a lot of people are saying in lawsuits now as they sue their medical providers, that they were not actually able to give informed consent to these procedures. And that also their parents weren't actually able to give informed consent because they weren't given all the information. And that is partially because the doctors don't have all the information because it's experimental. But that's not something that anyone wants to talk about.